Hi there, I'm Steve Kirkwood, a Senior Lecturer in Social Work for the University of Edinburgh and an Associate Director of the Scottish Centre for Crime and Justice Research. It's my pleasure to introduce our second event for the Centre's new series called Just About, which will explore the impact of the pandemic on the criminal justice system. The format is a hybrid between a podcast and a webinar, which we sometimes refer to as a podinar, if we can keep a straight face, involving a pre-recorded conversation between people with different types of expertise on a topic, which we then stream live within a webinar event to extend the dialogue and discussion. In this session, we will be discussing the impact of the pandemic on people who are affected by imprisonment or subject to community sentences. All of us have experienced massive changes and restrictions in our lives over the last year or so, and some of us who have never stepped foot in prison might nevertheless have felt imprisoned in our homes, particularly if required to shield or isolate for long periods of time. But what about those who are actually in prisons, or those who are subject to other restrictions, such as community sentences? And how has the pandemic affected the ability for people affected by a criminal justice system to access the support that they require? We know that the impact of the criminal justice system is felt unequally across society, and that the pandemic has exposed and amplified many pre-existing inequalities. So it's crucial to understand the impact on those who have been affected, its implications for justice, and what this means as we move towards recovery. Thankfully, we're joined by speakers who have a great deal of expertise and insights on these issues. So I'm now going to invite my panelists to introduce themselves.
My name is Natalie Logan Maclean. I am the CEO of SISCO, and we are a criminal justice service predominantly working in the Scottish prison service, but trying to bridge the gap between prison and local communities. Thanks, Steve, for inviting me on.
Marguerite, and my research in the past has mostly focused on how people make sense or give meaning to their sentence. But recently a team of my colleagues and I looked at the impact of COVID and looked on different vulnerable groups. I was one of the leads on the criminal justice stream in that research.
I'm Kevin Coyne. I'm a community mentor by SISCO, helping boys coming out of prison into the community.
That's great. Thanks very much for joining us today, Kevin. So I'm going to direct my first question to Natalie. Your organisation provides crucial support for those who are affected by imprisonment. How have you seen people's needs and experiences affected by the pandemic?
For us, we work very frontline on a ground level anyway, so we see the realities of what goes on in prison, i.e. drug use, trauma, the chaos, the family systems. We see all the levels of dysfunction at a very ground force level. However, the pandemic has brought levels of desperation that I have never witnessed in my life before, both community and prison. So throughout the pandemic at different stages, as the restrictions have eased, myself and the team have been able to go back into prison. Almost everyone that I've ever worked with has picked back up drugs again, so they've relapsed. And that is purely down to being on a 23.5-hour lockup. We know that the majority of men in prison that come from addiction backgrounds also come from poverty and disadvantage. We're in 2021, yet we're still not focusing on trauma and disadvantage. You know, we operate looking at Maslow, and we fully understand that in order for someone to have a relatively meaningful life, we as services have to meet the needs of the individual that's coming to access the support. No basic needs are being met. You can't expect someone to leave a prison environment, which is chaotic, put them into a hostel, which is a prison without locks on the door, and expect them to live a meaningful life. You know, we're not even meeting the basic needs during the pandemic because services closed. They worked rurally from home, which we understand, we get that, but if we're saying that we're in the care field, but we take away the element of care, then what does that leave as a worker?
So it's not only affecting people while they're in prison itself, but actually, you know, in coming out of prison and about their access to services on the outside.
There is minimum access to services on the outside. That's the thing, Steve, and there hasn't been. They're now starting to open up very slowly, but we were one of the very few services that made the decision not to close and to stay open 7 days a week, and not to be Monday, Friday, 9 to 5, you know, to be that service that stood outside the box and didn't conform with the expectations of what other services say. You know, my understanding is if someone gets out of prison at 4 o'clock on a Friday, but services close at 5 o'clock on a Friday, what support is individuals going to get? You know, whereas we'll be that service that says, you know, if you get out at 4, we're not going to close until we know that you're in a safe environment, that you have food, that some of your needs are being met. At least some of them. We can't meet them all. We don't have a magic wand, but there's just no needs being met. It's quite harrowing to watch, Steve.
And you were talking there about addictions and the way that people are trying to manage their circumstances. Do you think part of this is to do with like the virus itself, or is it actually primarily the kinds of restrictions that people are facing?
I don't think it's been the pandemic. I think the pandemic's only highlighted the problems that were there to begin with, and that's in reality. These problems were existing in society, but the pandemic has probably magnified the horrors of what is existing in our communities. It's really, really bad. And when you work at frontline service level and you see it, I don't come home at night with any excitement in my life, put it that way. I come home and I worry about individuals. I think, are they going to make it? Are they going to use? It's a tough job to be in at this moment, and especially because we are one of the very few services that remained open.
In terms of the support that your organisation has provided and perhaps other organisations, are there some things that you've done to try and respond to the situation, things which you think are helping?
We were never a community-based service. We were prison-based. We only responded to the demand due to the pandemic. We were looking at long-term to become community-based and support individuals on their full transition from prison, but we literally responded to a lot of our client groups emailing through Email a Prisoner saying, you know, I'm out in 2 days, I don't have accommodation, I don't know what I'm going to do. So we really responded to the demand. We were overwhelmed with referrals. It was continuous calls from the prison, from some of the staff that we know to say, look, can you support this individual? He's out tomorrow. So we really responded to the fact that other services were closed, and we picked up on the slack. That's the truth of it.
And I mean, at any time it's going to be terrible for people coming out of prison to not have accommodation to go to. In the context of a pandemic, obviously, it raises all sorts of other issues about how people are meant to keep safe, you know, from the virus and its impact.
Again, I think the virus has just really magnified an existing problem that was already there, because the reality is, when I read all the research and I read all the paperwork that's provided by the government and Scottish Prison Service, and on paper it looks beautiful and it reads beautiful. So let's look at the SHORE standards. Safe housing on release for everyone. So when I read that, I think this is really good. It reads really good. You know, it means these guys are going to leave prison and there's going to be a safe house for them. That is amazing, when in reality is we are throwing people from prison into more trauma. We're putting them into hostels where they might have enemies there, they might have run up drug debts in prison, there might be dealers, you know, so it's a very hostile environment just now for individuals leaving prison. It's really tough to witness.
Thanks very much for that, Natalie. And as you say, clearly it's not just that the pandemic has created a whole new situation, but it's just actually making these inequalities and issues just even more stark. Thanks very much for that. I'm now going to move on to Marguerite. Now, you've conducted a great deal of research into the experiences of imprisonment in the criminal justice system over the years. including the recent study on Scotland and lockdown. So from a research perspective, firstly, could I ask you, what have you learned about the impact of the pandemic on the operation and the effects of imprisonment?
Yeah, thanks, Steve. So some of it has already been highlighted by Natalie, and I think maybe the most important thing is the way that people were locked up for like almost a whole day with very little time to be even out of their cell. But there was also some other issues we found. So like Leslie says, like it looks good on paper, but we found that in prison, prisoners themselves and staff actually had little access to information or access to guidance about what they should be doing. There was a lack of consistency, so some staff members would do one thing, other staff members would be doing another. So we distributed a prison survey, for example, and people told us that some people would let them all out at the same time, so they were all crowded together, whereas other staff members would let them out like in sections, and that also meant that they didn't feel like they had any control over keeping themselves safe. And prisoners weren't given any kind of protective masks at all until at least September, I think. That and other issues led to a kind of a sense of being forgotten or being treated like animals. Some people described it as just like not being seen as humans with the same kind of value as anybody else. People talked a lot about the lack of access to services. So we also interviewed people who had come out of prison during this time. And people said they really had a hard time coping because they had developed ways of coping with imprisonment that relied, for example, on going to education or going to the gym. And that was no longer available, obviously, when you're in your cell the whole time. But also services like seem to have pretty much disappeared. And we especially heard about health and mental health services that just weren't available even when you were in distress, like in significant distress. And we had some questionnaires back from people who were very clear that they really, really needed help, but that help just wasn't available. And that could be in terms of like necessary medication to stay healthy or to stay well, food for diabetics, but also mental health again. And people were mentioning increased suicides in certain prisons. We also found that for people who are on a longer term sentence, they have to show that they're ready to move to the next stage, and usually so to the open estate or to the top end. And usually the way to do that is to attend courses, but these courses were also not running, so people couldn't progress, and that led to them feeling like they were in limbo. You know, when is this going to start again? How long is my sentence going to be? And then finally, another main thing we found was the issue with visiting. So visits were stopped completely at the start of the pandemic. And then slowly some online facilities were brought in, and people were given mobile phones, but those mobile phones only have so many minutes on it and you can't extend it. And the virtual visits were very difficult often because of technical issues, but also there was not a lot of consideration for family members' lives. For example, if you have children in nursery and the only time is during that nursery time, then the parent in prison can never see their child, and that wasn't really taken into account. Yeah, so I've already mentioned some of the impacts. So we definitely saw worsening mental health and physical health as well. But a lot of people mentioned gaining weight because they're not able to go or even move that much if you're stuck in a cell. We were told that the atmosphere had really changed and that relationships with staff were much worse because staff were reallocated to different places, but were mostly there just to, you know, lock people up. There wasn't much else going on. And also some sense that staff resented having to come into work and be exposed to the COVID risk when prisoners felt exposed to COVID risks by the staff because they were the ones going in and out. Feelings of being forgotten, treated like dirt, losing connection. So that's with family, but also with people in the prison because people haven't been able to associate with each other. And people have given us examples, for example, of having to choose to have your phone call or get a meal and to speak to other prisoners. You know, that's the time you have every day, and you need to make those kind of decisions.
Yeah, it's really some very shocking experiences that you're reporting there, both in terms of how people are actually being treated, you know, in relation to the virus itself, but obviously the restrictions and the impact on how prison is operating on them, and just how much more restrictive that is. So that's the experiences of people in prison, and I understand you also conducted research to do with people who are on community sentences. So what were some of their experiences?
Can I actually just say before I move on is that even though these experiences sound really shocking, like at the same time, a lot of people reported that things were pretty much the same as usual. And so we do also need to remember that prison usually is also a really awful environment, and that a lot of people don't get to benefit from things like education. So like Natalie said, it's more exposing, but like making things a little bit worse rather than it necessarily being night and day with how it usually is. But in the community, and Natalie's also described some of this already. So most contact, especially criminal justice social work contact, mostly reduced to phone calls, whereas people usually have to go into the office to see their criminal justice social worker. And the only exception there were the people who were deemed the most risk. You know, the most risky people would still have to come into the office, but thereby also felt very exposed to the risk of COVID, right? So that was a difficult thing. There was a withdrawal of kind of the statutory sector and larger organizations, as Natalie's already described, but that also it wasn't necessarily only about criminal justice, but also about the council or housing. Like when you no longer can walk into an office and you don't have a lot of experience or the access to digital technology, then how are you supposed to negotiate these things within the pandemic? And there was very little support with this as well. And like Natalie's already described, we really did find that some of the smallest organizations ended up carrying the most of the burden and really going above and beyond by making sure people have clothes, food, but also digital means of contacting others. And so basically mobile phone and some data. And we're the only people providing in-person support a lot of the time. There was some exceptions in criminal justice social work, but usually it was the small organizations who felt they could do that and the big organizations who felt like they couldn't or they didn't because of, you know, I don't know, organizational priorities or policies or whatever was going on. So the other thing we found was that because the courts were pretty much closed orders, so people were on a community order, like a community payback order or another kind of order, they weren't finishing, or their restrictions weren't easing because there's no access to court, so you can't go in front of the judge to finish your order. On the other hand, some people welcomed the lessening of control that they felt from having a phone call compared to having to go into an office and not everything that involved. So there was some people who welcomed the lessening of control, but the flip side is that other people felt that they lost support. So people were really reliant on their criminal justice social work and the groups that were run to see people and to feel like they were part of a community. They suffered. And again, like Natalie's already described, it's very difficult to come out of prison in these conditions and to have to navigate this new system where you can't actually walk into an office, for example. And the other thing to note here is that we only spoke to people who we were able to contact through organizations like SISCO, like the other organizations. And so they're the person with some help. So we're also very aware that we didn't speak to the people who had the very worst experiences.
Thanks very much for that. And many of the issues that you've raised, you know, raise broader questions about justice. So you talk about, for instance, people's orders being extended, about if they haven't been able to access some of the group work programs, for instance, to demonstrate that they are, you know, engaging, that might actually mean that their sentence in prison ends up being longer. What kinds of issues do you think are raised about justice in this context?
Sorry. So in terms of imprisonment, we really did find that like imprisonment at the moment is much harsher than usual, right? It's not really the same sentence in terms of what it entails and we've made the link before with the definition of torture in terms of solitary confinement. Everybody in prison by now, like it's only a few weeks of solitary confinement, I think, and everybody went way beyond that. So imprisonment is deeper, like people are being held further away from the world and they have less contact with the outside world. It's heavier because it's much more difficult to get through it, to experience it. But for the people for whom progression is not happening, it's also actually longer, right? So it's the equivalent of being given a longer sentence at the sentencing stage, and they're kind of stuck in limbo. And except for the few people who had who had early release, like they were released quite early on in the pandemic, like there's been no shortening of sentences. So there's no compensation for this anywhere. Nobody's saying, okay, because you are being held in these really difficult conditions, we're going to shorten your sentence. On the other hand, in terms of community justice, the government reduced the unpaid work element of community payback orders, and I think it was by 35%. But then again, not for people that they feel like they can't sell that for, so not for domestic abuse offenders or sexual offenders or people convicted of stalking. But if you read the reasons for reducing those sentences, it's not so much in terms of, it's not explained in terms of justice. You know, these people have this hanging over them for longer and longer and longer because they can't actually do the work. But it's instead explained in terms of service capacity, that criminal justice social work and associated services won't be able to put through all the work orders that they have to do when they're starting to catch up. So I think really there has been no attention paid from the government level or anywhere else to the justice inherent. If we say it's criminal justice, which is totally questionable in the first place, then we can't just suddenly do something different and longer and worse and then still think it's just.
Yeah, absolutely. I think, and it's interesting, as you say, just that the responses have been primarily about the logistical challenges of how do you actually, maintain the criminal justice system, rather than these more integral questions about, well, is it still just, and how do we deal with that? So thanks very much for that. Now, Kevin, you act as a mentor, and so I was curious what you could say about what you've seen in terms of the impact of the pandemic on people who are in the criminal justice system.
Yeah, from my experience, it is, see, a lot of the clients, the men who leave in prison, that their mental health has been right through the roof because there are no services open to that, you know what I mean? These boys need a structure in their life, you know what I mean? A routine. If all the hell up, if you don't get a routine and nothing to go to, you're just going to go back to your old ways, you know what I mean? Go using, drinking, all stuff like that. So you're just trying to give them a safe environment, you know what I mean, to help them. But a lot of them have got trauma, so like different clients, older and young ones, you know what I mean? So like you need to kind of be different. I mean, we're open like 7 days a week, but it doesn't shut at 5 o'clock. It's like I'm on call all the time because these boys could be brand new all day, and then it comes to like 12 o'clock at night, and they're phoning you and need a wee chat with you to see how they're on that. It's just their mental health's just been going right through the roof. So it's just trying to get everything open back up in it and help them.
So it's really difficult for people to cope under these circumstances and the ways that they're trying to deal with that. For instance, if people are using drugs, then it's likely that they're just going to end up in an even worse situation.
I see. The way I used to be, with my experience, it was, see, when I used to use drinking drugs, it showed me how long when I just came off drinking drugs, it was boring, right? So that just showed me if I only really drank and used drugs because I was bored. So it takes it away, but then your mental health goes through the roof, and then you're waking up with all different problems, not on top of it. It's just people just need something to do, something to fill their day. And with this pandemic, nothing's been open, so they're really, really struggling.
You mentioned, there about the experiences of trauma. I mean, to be in this kind of like circumstance, or like Marguerite was saying about actually experiencing, basically solitary confinement, what kind of impacts do you think that's having on people?
See, it's all different with different people, but a lot of people must be thinking about suicidal thoughts and all that, take their own lives. It's not nice, is it? Especially if you're not got any family and you're stuck in the house yourself, not allowed to leave. People are really, really struggling these days.
Are you finding, ways that people are trying to cope? Are there things that people are finding to really help them through this time?
Because he like see the social distance and all that. See, we were just trying to get people out walking, a bit of exercise and that, just trying to fill their day up, helping people. See, like we used to go out like a jogging at. It's a 5k jog, but a lot of the clients are at different bits of their journey, so half of them are not fit enough. So we'll just get some at walking, some at jogging. But some of them really enjoyed the exercise. Exercise is the best thing for the head, you know what I mean? So it was really helping it. And we'll promote the cold water therapy too. So we try and promote that too, to get people out doing the cold water therapy. That's really good for your mental health.
Can you explain the cold water therapy?
It's like you go into locks, like normal water, freezing water. You're in it for a couple of minutes. It takes your stress levels right down. I do it a lot. I mean, it's really helped my mental health, and it's brilliant for you, man. It's class. I swear you should get a go.
Sounds good. One of the issues I'm aware of is like because so much stuff has gone online. That requires people to have access to, you know, digital devices and so on. The people that you're engaging with, do they tend to have access to those types of devices that can they get online?
It's mostly them have got phones, isn't they? But a lot of people with drug problems that they don't like going on Zoom meetings. Our clients were hating it, you know what I mean? So sometimes you weren't really getting a lot of them coming on, and sometimes some of them were coming on, but a lot of them just don't like staring into a camera. I'm a bit nervous myself when I do it too, but just because early last year I've been doing it, so I'm kind of used to it now.
That's great. Thanks very much. Many of the issues that each of you have raised, I think, touch on a couple of things. One is the already existing issues to do with the criminal justice system and the inequalities that we face and how these might have been exacerbated or revealed by the pandemic. So there's how do we actually change the criminal justice system? What are some of the problems with it that might have actually already been there? But also, what are the things that need to be done to help us recover actually from the impact of the pandemic? I wondered, Natalie, did you want to offer some thoughts on this? You know, what are maybe some of the things that this has really revealed that we need to kind of take attention to, as well as those things that we need to focus on to help the system and people recover from the pandemic?
Oh. Okay, so my honest answer is, what do we need to change? This, I actually heard a lifer who had done a law degree was very passionate when he used to say, you know, there has to be radical changes in the criminal justice. And initially I thought, oh my God, you are so much, you need to calm down. But the longer that I worked in criminal justice, I recognised there has to be radical changes from policy right down to practice. Marguerite hit on it, you know, we call ourselves a justice system, but there's no just in it. I understand that if you commit a crime, there needs to be a punishment element to it, and for some men that punishment is ultimately going to be prison. My idea as a taxpayer is, if we're sending people to prison and I'm out working to pay for these men to be residing in there, then I want to know that men are going to be in prison and they're going to be reformed. So there's going to be support, education, we're going to be nurturing their needs, we're going to be saying, okay, you've never been loved, I'm going to teach you what love is. And they're going to leave prison and they're going to have some of these needs that have been met, meaning for community services, it's easier for community to pick up. Also, the same with community, we need to change from policy right down to practice. What I have witnessed is service providers have become very, very comfortable by saying, we're a trauma-informed service. But then you ask them, what happens if your client doesn't attend 3 appointments? Or they're disengaged. So then what makes you trauma-informed? You know, so things like that need to change. Service provision saying, you know, there needs to be lines drawn sometimes. Who decides what the line is? If we're saying this individual has been traumatised by life, why are we giving them 3 appointments when they're out the door? Why are we creating lines for people when their whole life has been a barrier? So for me, it's about, if you're going to say you're trauma-informed, please understand what it means to be a trauma-informed service, because what we need to do as service providers is to nurture individuals back into health. We don't punish any other illness in the world other than addiction. Addiction in the NICE guidelines and the yellow guidelines, it's defined as an illness, yet we punish people in prison for it. If guys on top end use drugs, they're punished for 2 years, so they're punished for being addicted to a substance that most of them picked up in prison to begin with as a coping strategy to deal with the crime they committed, because, you know, they're scared. So there's so much, you know, I could tear every document apart and help someone recreate it, but I think in order for anything to change, it has to be radical, and it has to be from policy filtered right down to practice. You know, we as professionals can go into different prison establishments and we can be treated like a con. We could be treated like a prisoner by some of the staff. You know, you see how individuals really enforce power in their job, and, you know, the way that I'm even spoke to sometimes as a professional staff member, and I just think, if that's how you're speaking to me, I can only but imagine how you're speaking to vulnerable individuals that would really take that personal, and that could potentially, you know, they could potentially take their life on how you're spoken to. So, yep, from me, it has to be radical and it has to be policy to practice, and the government have to care, really. That's the reality. They have to care a wee bit more.
Thanks, Natalie. Yeah, and what you're getting at is what is the purpose of prison, you know, and is it actually, you know, doing what it ought to do? And this is not just about the pandemic. These are all fundamental issues which are, you know, were there before this hit. Marguerite, I wondered if you wanted to say a bit about, you know, based on, you know, the research you've conducted, for instance, you know, what needs to be done, as I say, both to try and assist with the recovery phase, but also more fundamentally, actually, in terms of the criminal justice system and how it operates.
Well, I think you're going to get a fairly similar answer. So I think the first step really is that what has happened during the pandemic should be taken seriously, and things should be done. Like Natalie was saying, it started, people are still being looked up for 23 hours a day, and that's, or 23 and a half hours a day anyway, and so it's still ongoing. And so obviously something needs to change there. And why is it, for example, that some prisoners can be open much more in some prisons and not in others? And if there's no difference in infection rates, why aren't they learning from each other? But also in terms of the length of sentences and how long people should serve under these conditions, I think that's really the first step that should be addressed. I think what's really interesting as well is that studies in different places have shown that there's been no increase in crime, even when quite a lot of people have been released. So that again makes us question, like, what are we keeping all these people locked up for, if doing so doesn't really have much of an impact on crime. One thing that, I mean, I'm really full of admiration for what Natalie and Kevin do, but like, small organizations are really vulnerable to funding ending, funding cuts. So I think one thing that also really needs to happen, that this pandemic has shown kind of across the board, is that the organizations that really like step up, they need to have ongoing funding and not huge application forms for funding, because how are they going to do that if they're a small organization, they don't have funding officers and these kind of things. So I think that's really important. But I also ultimately think that it would be great if this pandemic could be a spark for also a societal rethink of imprisonment. Like Natalie says, like, where is the justice in the criminal justice system? And we've recently, in a group that I'm part of, started calling it the punishment system, because that seems to be all that we're doing. And really for more people maybe to realize, like, I think a lot of people take prison for granted as the right response to crime, but don't understand what is actually going on, what the actual experiences are the people are there, what the actual crimes are that people go for, how those people themselves have been harmed and are being harmed by the criminal justice system itself as well.
Thanks. Yeah, some really fundamental questions about the criminal justice system and how it operates. And a really important point there about those small organisations. I read in your research report about how it was some of the smallest charities, for instance, like SISCO and others, who are having to kind of fill this gap. And as you say, those organisations themselves may be in quite vulnerable and precarious situations. Kevin, I just wanted to turn to you to again, based on your experience, what are the things that you think really need to change to support people who are affected by the criminal justice system?
I just think more money has to go into it, and more support, and listen to the people who come out of prison. And that a lot of people just see like the boys as their previous convictions and that, and they don't really listen. I mean, I think you just need to listen and ask the boys what come out of prison, what did they really, what you could change, and then you would have a good idea. You know what I mean? If you ask the boys what should happen, they would tell you. You know what I mean? Instead of just somebody who's never really been through any experience in that, just read out a book and just think they know best, and they just come to agreement. You know what I mean? You just need to keep on asking more people who come out of prison what do you think should happen, and I think that's what would help.
Thanks very much. All right. Well, I really appreciate all of your comments today. I think what you've highlighted is just how the system operates, and the pandemic has shed light on those inequalities, those issues, and some really challenging issues around justice, what it means, how it operates, and as you've said, hopefully there's possibilities here to try and shed light to support more radical rethinking of actually how the criminal justice system operates and its impact on people, so that it can be some lessons learned for the future. So thanks everyone for your participation in the discussion today, and the audience for watching. You can find out more about SISCO on their website. That's sisco.org.uk, spelled SISCO.org.uk. And the Scotland in Lockdown study also has a website. That's scotlandinlockdown.co.uk. And for more information on further events from the Scottish Centre for Crime and Justice Research, you can visit our website, which is www.sccjr.ac.uk. Thanks very much for your attention, and take care.